I had just finished a long day fixing a loose board on my barn when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A bright orange notice was tacked to my gate, and in bold letters, it read, "City inspectors will be visiting your property for code violations." My barn, the one I had poured months of sweat and love into, was suddenly under threat. And of course, the reason it was flagged was no accident. HOA Karen had been lurking around, and I knew she had called the inspectors herself. Karen had always been the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer, a woman with a clipboard and an opinion about every single thing anyone owned. When she moved in, I thought she'd be harmless, maybe even friendly. But it didn't take long before she began policing every flower bed, mailbox and fence in sight, and my barn, tucked behind my property, apparently posed some serious aesthetic violation in her eyes. I felt a mix of disbelief and fury. This wasn't just about a barn. This was about someone thinking they had the power to dictate what I could do on my own land. I knew her game. She loved the drama, the power trip, the idea that someone would scramble to fix something just because she said so. But I had a little experience dealing with people like Karen, and I wasn't about to roll over. The next morning, 2 city inspectors arrived, clipboards in hand, scanning every inch of my barn. I walked them through everything, calmly explaining the structural integrity, the permits I had filed, and the safety measures I had taken. They nodded politely but still scribbled notes, clearly trying to satisfy the HOA's complaints. Karen, of course, was nowhere to be seen. She preferred to lurk in the background, enjoying the tension she created. That evening, after the inspectors left with vague promises of follow-up, I stepped outside to check the barn. Everything seemed fine, but then I noticed a strange water pooling near the foundation. I frowned, trying to trace it back, and realized with a sinking feeling that Karen had diverted rainwater from her property to mine. She had literally engineered a flood in my yard, hoping to weaken the barn's foundation. I couldn't believe the lengths she would go to. I decided then that I wouldn't just sit back and watch my property get destroyed. I would fight back, but carefully. Karma, I thought, has a funny way of balancing things out, and I had a feeling Karen's overconfidence might just be her undoing. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rushing water. Only this time, it wasn't coming from my barn. I peeked outside and froze. Karen's backyard, the one she meticulously landscaped and bragged about to everyone, was under 3 inches of water. Her sprinkler system had malfunctioned. Somehow, the diverted rainwater had flowed back onto her property, flooding her garage and soaking everything inside. I couldn't help but smirk. It was the kind of poetic justice I didn't even have to plan. Of course, I kept my distance. Karen thrived on confrontation and would have blamed me instantly, twisting the story to make herself the victim. But from my vantage point, I watched her sprint to the garage, shrieking at the top of her lungs. I could hear her yelling about ruined tools, water damage, and "this is sabotage," the very words she had been using against me all week. The irony was delicious, and yet, I reminded myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to give her a single opportunity to escalate things further. But Karen predictably couldn't resist. By noon, she had called the HOA, the city, and even the local news, claiming that I had tampered with her water system. When I calmly pointed out that the water had naturally followed the slope of her own property, she practically went into cardiac arrest. I had never seen someone so flustered by facts. As the day went on, her garage doors jammed completely, trapping several boxes and tools inside. I overheard her neighbors whispering about how karma caught up with her, and it made me realize that even in a small community, people notice when someone constantly tries to manipulate others. For once, Karen wasn't in control. The satisfaction was undeniable. By evening, she had enlisted a crew to pump out the water, and the HOA had sent an inspector to mediate the situation. I greeted him politely, showing him my property, my barn, and explaining how the water had naturally flowed. His eyes widened as he calculated the slope of both properties and compared it to her claims. Karen's face turned a shade of red I've only seen in cartoons, and she realized she had no evidence to back up her accusations. It was at that moment, watching her flail, that I knew the tide had shifted. Karen, the all-powerful neighborhood watchdog, was now the one scrambling to save her own property, her credibility crumbling with every passing hour. And the barn? It stood perfectly intact, dry as a bone. A silent testament to my patience and persistence. Little did she know this was just the beginning. The chain reaction she had started, her obsession with control, her endless meddling, was about to backfire in ways she never imagined. By the next morning, Karen's obsession had reached a fever pitch. She stormed into my yard, clipboard in hand, insisting that I remove the barn entirely. She ranted about zoning, violations, safety hazards, and community standards. her voice echoing across the neighborhood. But this time I stayed calm. I had learned long ago that reacting to her hysteria only fueled her fire. Instead, I let her words hang in the air, giving the absurdity of her claims all the space they needed to reveal themselves. As she paced, I noticed the ground near her property still saturated from the previous flood. Her garden beds were wilting, mud clinging to her shoes, and her prized decorative fountain had tipped over. I fought the urge to point it out. There was no need. Her neighbors were already staring from their porches, whispering, clearly entertained. Even her closest friends seemed to question whether Karen's energy was worth the drama. Karen, of course, ignored all of this. She marched up to my barn and began snapping photos, muttering about evidence for the city inspectors. I didn't stop her, knowing that any interaction would only give her more ammunition. But then, something unexpected happened. One of her own garden stakes, likely loosened during the flood, collapsed, sending her carefully stacked planter boxes toppling. She stumbled backward, crashing into her garage door, which immediately gave way under the pressure. The sound was thunderous. Wood splintered, metal screeched, and water from the still leaking system gushed further inside. Karen's scream could be heard across the street, a mix of terror, frustration, and disbelief. For the first time, I saw her not as a fearsome HOA enforcer, but as someone utterly powerless in the face of her own chaos. Her carefully constructed world was unraveling, and it had nothing to do with me. By now, neighbors had gathered, whispering and pointing. Some were clearly shocked, others amused, but all were witnessing the complete reversal of roles. Karen frantically tried to salvage her garage, her possessions and her reputation, but it was clear she had underestimated the consequences of her obsession with control. The irony was thick. She had spent weeks trying to enforce rules on everyone else, only to have every plan backfire spectacularly on her own property. I stood back, letting her handle the mess she created, feeling a mix of relief and vindication. The barn remained untouched, standing tall as a symbol of patience, persistence, and careful planning. Karen's meltdown was a harsh but necessary lesson in humility. Little did she know, the final act of this story was just around the corner, and it would leave a mark on the neighborhood that no HOA threat could ever erase. By the following morning, the neighborhood had fully absorbed the chaos Karen had unleashed on herself. Word had spread quickly. The woman who spent years policing everyone else's property was now the one scrambling to fix her own disaster. Her garage, once pristine and immaculate, had become a soggy ruin. Her prized tools were waterlogged, and her carefully curated decorations lay scattered across mud and debris. Karen arrived with an army of contractors, each one shaking their heads at the damage. She barked orders, trying desperately to regain control, but it was clear to anyone watching that her authority had evaporated. The irony wasn't lost on the neighbors, many of whom had quietly witnessed her relentless campaigns against perfectly legal fences, gardens, and home improvements. For once, Karen was powerless, and it was fascinating to watch. Meanwhile, I spent the morning inspecting my barn, making sure nothing had been compromised by the earlier water diversion. Everything was perfectly intact. My crops, my animals, my structures, all untouched. It was more than just a win. It was a statement. Karen's obsession with control and perfection had led to her own undoing, while my patience, preparation, and respect for the law had protected what was mine. By mid-afternoon, the city inspectors returned, not because of me, but because Karen had filed new complaints about her own flooding. They walked her through her property, pointing out that much of the damage had been caused by her own water diversion, attempts and poor drainage. She sputtered, arguing, blaming, and insisting someone was out to get her, but there was no evidence. Not one shred! The inspector shook his head and quietly walked away, leaving Karen red-faced and speechless. From my porch, I watched her finally realize the truth. Her obsession with policing others had turned against her. All the threats, the complaints, the endless surveillance, it had all backfired. She couldn't enforce rules on anyone else if she couldn't even manage her own property. The lesson was clear, and the neighborhood knew it. By evening, Karen had retreated inside, defeated, while I leaned against the barn and took a deep breath. The crops thrived, the barn stood proud, and for the first time, the neighborhood saw that patience, preparation, and a little poetic justice could outmatch arrogance and obsession. As the sun set, casting golden light over my property, I realized something important. When people try to control the world around them without regard for others, life has a way of flipping the script. And in Karen's case, it did so spectacularly. The barn remained, my crops flourished, and Karen's garage, well, it became a cautionary tale that no HOA power trip could ever erase. The story is over, but the lesson? Some things are just too stubborn to control. If you enjoyed this crazy HOA showdown, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any wild stories like this. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done if Karen tried this with your property. And don't forget to smash the like button if you love seeing karma in action.